Welcome everybody to another mini lecture. Today we're going to be talking about types of journal articles. Many things are published by journals, not just scientific research papers. So when reading the scientific literature, it's important to be able to decipher the difference between a scientific paper, scientific research paper that employs the scientific method, and a paper that is an opinion piece or epidemiology or whatever it may be. Just because a journal publishes something doesn't mean that it's a fact. And just because a research article claims to use the scientific method doesn't mean that they actually use the scientific method either, which is what we've been talking about in the last episodes of this playlist. So to define a few things, journal articles are pretty much anything published by a journal. Okay, let's go over the different types of journal articles. Of course, first we have original research papers. These can also be called empirical articles or empirical research. Essentially, this is what should employ the scientific method. These are the experimental research papers. These depict the experiment of a scientist. However, you may think that these employ the scientific method. There are many different types. So of course we have the controlled experiments. And so within a controlled experiment, there's an aim to manipulate the independent variables to see the effect on the dependent variable. We talked about this in our hypothesis video. We talked about this in many videos. But within the controlled experiment, you're also trying to minimize the confounding variables. You're really trying to isolate the independent variables. And if you can't isolate the independent variable, you're going to try and set it up in a manner to be able to induce some information about the independent variable. And so it's not always possible to isolate an independent variable. It's very important that there is logic and reason behind something that cannot be isolated. In my mind, within a scientific experiment, the isolation is part of the logic of the scientific method. And so if it's impossible to isolate an independent variable and you rely on reasoning to induce some sort of information about an independent variable and its causal relationship to a dependent variable, it really makes no sense. You're far removed from empirical evidence. And so all this is touted as empirical evidence. However, often we get away from what is truly observed. But I digress. This is not the purpose of the video. We're going to be talking about types of articles. Okay, next under the umbrella of original research papers or empirical papers, you have observational studies. Now, in observational studies, the researchers make no attempt at isolating or manipulating any variables, right? It's purely based on observation. And so you may think, well, this is true empirical nature. Perhaps in a way it is. But the second they try to induce any sort of information, remember, we're getting away from what is truly empirical. In essence, these studies can be cross-sectional, longitudinal. They can also be controlled case studies. And we're going to get more in depth into the different types of experiments. I'm just trying to highlight what original research papers are, what is considered an original research paper in the literature. Under this umbrella, we also have surveys and questionnaires, and often this is considered epidemiological research. Of course, there's no attempt at isolating any variables. There's no attempt at accounting for confounding variables. It's all based off of self-reported data. A lot of this is done over the phone nowadays or over the internet, right? So there's really no connection there with the clients. Realistically, with the surveys and questionnaires, nothing should ever be interpreted from it, right? With epidemiology, nothing should ever be interpreted from it. It should only be used as a means to generate a hypothesis. And, really you'd want to move up the ladder here, which is a viable approach, right? If you do surveys and questionnaires to get general information about populations, there is no truth here. And then it would be good to go observe things in their natural environment and see what you can see and observe, and again, generate more in-depth, precise hypotheses, and then moved into a controlled experiment where you actually isolate variables, where you're actually concerned about the confounding variables. And this is what would get closer to the truth. And of course, if you employ falsification under that umbrella of the controlled experiments, and you break down theories and you falsify theories, and then you're getting into the crux of true science. However, far too often what you see is surveys and questionnaires touted as like scientific facts, which is absurd. This is true rhetoric. This is true rhetoric in its very prime, because it's very easy to manipulate these surveys. Obviously, a good example I'm thinking of is, 4 out of 5 dentists recommend this certain type of toothpaste. Let me see the survey. How did you pick the dentist? Did you omit any dentists from that? Did you omit a certain number of them, or did you run the study 15 times until you got the desired result, thinking that, you're abiding by the scientific method because the 15th study that you published showed 4 out of 5 dentists support your brand, right? Kind of funny. But it's absurd to deduce any sort of, or induce any sort of information from a survey or questionnaire. And so it's not true science. But again, I digress. It's not the purpose of this video. Okay, another branch of types of journal articles are review articles. These are very common. They're commonly referenced on Instagram, social media, things of this nature. They're commonly referenced by scientists as well. And for good reason in theory, right? Because if the controlled experiments are good, a review article could be helpful. So essentially, a review article is a comprehensive summary of a certain line or branch of research to essentially encompass all of the previous literature on a topic. And what you want to do with this is you're essentially taking all of this, and this is almost a way to generate theories, to generate more comprehensive theories, because you're basing it off of many original research papers, right? Should be basing it solely on controlled experiments, on studies that use the scientific method. So review articles are great. They're very helpful because you can see a large amount of research in one paper. Now, of course, as you will understand at this point how misleading this could be, considering the pollutedness of the literature itself, considering the amount of studies that don't employ the scientific method properly. There also could be bias in the types of articles chosen. So it's really important to understand this, right? And the methods section of a review article is their methods, is the way that they attempted to scour the literature, right? That's how they deciphered which studies to incorporate. So studies with this experimental design or with these parameters or looking at this population were included in the studies, and studies that did not have this or that had these aspects were excluded from the study. And so that's the methods of a review article, right? So it's not necessarily the scientific method per se. However, it should be based off of studies that employed the scientific method. All right, so you have, under this branch of review articles, you have literature reviews or narrative reviews. And essentially, these are papers that cover a certain topic over a period of time. There's no standardized approach. There's no systemic approach to the paper itself. They're often very broad in nature. They don't necessarily need to be specific, right? There aren't really any rules when it comes to a literature review. So if you see this in the title or the abstract or the introduction, you need to understand that, well, you need to understand what the paper aims to do, right? Because the paper itself should set its own parameters up. It should set up its own approach to conducting this literature review. Now, on the other hand, you have a systematic review. And as the name suggests, you take a systematic and explicit approach to reviewing the literature, to criticize the literature, to choose which literature is implemented into the paper, the systematic review itself. There's a very standardized way of doing this, right? And realistically, you're aiming to minimize bias. You're really trying to compile the evidence in a truthful manner here. This is what a systematic review aims to do. It really tries to encompass as much of the literature as it possibly can in a non-biased manner by using a systematic approach to do the research, to analyze critically, and to implement that research into their paper. And lastly, you have something called a meta-analysis. And this is essentially a type of systematic review, but they may employ statistical methods to reevaluate data. And so essentially it's just a systematic review with statistics. Again, you can see how that could be misleading. You can see how all of these reviews could be misleading. Review articles can be misleading because one, it depends on the nature of the original research, the employment of the scientific method, and it also depends on the research that's being included in the paper, right? It'd be very easy to have a look at the literature and set up your study in a way, even if it is systematic in nature, even if it is a meta-analysis, to set up your methods in a way that include positive research that supports your claim and exclude any research that doesn't. A truthful systematic review, you got to look at the methods as well, right? And so even with a review article, it's important to assess the methods. I know we've tailored our discussion so far largely to controlled experiments, but when considering review articles, it's important again to look at the methods, assess the way that they assessed papers, right? You want to understand how they assessed all of this. You want to understand how they included the papers, how they criticized the papers, what sort of data, what sort of methods were they looking for in the first place to critically evaluate a review article. And realistically, the problem is that to be sure of the truth of a theory, you would have to go and assess the original research papers, the controlled experiments, because it would rely on somebody else's research, or somebody else's critical approach. And so if they're not as critical as they should be, I think that we've done a good job being very critical of the scientific method and the employment thereof on this channel. I don't think many scientists take it that far. And that's what it takes. That's what it takes. It takes scrutiny, it takes extremism when it comes to the scientific method. It's the only way to employ the scientific method. And so if you are going to use the scientific method, if we are going to try and base our knowledge and our theories and our understanding of reality on research, you better use the scientific method properly. Okay, next here we have clinical case study. Now, this is a type of study that essentially is, you can look at the name, you can look at clinical. So this is usually has to do with the health sciences, with more tailored towards medicine. Essentially when it comes to a case study, they're really looking in depth into a single case. And so N equals 1, essentially. The population is of 1. And so statistical methods aren't usually employed in here. This is usually qualitative in nature, which we'll get into further in this lecture. But essentially what you're doing is taking a deep dive into a single case to see what kind of information you can deduce from that case. And so similarly, you have clinical trials, which are almost a branch of original research papers. I've kind of excluded these because these are specific to health sciences, to medicine, and largely to the pharmaceutical industry, if I'm being honest. Clinical trials are often used to test pharmaceutical drugs or supplements, right? Those fall under the same category realistically for the most part, right? And I suppose it would take a definition of what a supplement is, but anything that you see on the shelves of a store, right, in the pharmacy section tends to fall in this category that I'm speaking about here. So they run clinical trials where they run a controlled experiment. Again, is the scientific method properly employed? That's for you to determine. Giving you the tools to do that. We're going to go over some papers too in the future and look at these because it's obvious that a lot of these don't employ proper scientific method. And so with the clinical trials, it's essentially the same thing. It's just a controlled experiment that is related to the health sciences. So you may see this in the title or the abstract or the introduction. And essentially it just states that it is part of the health branch of the scientific literature. Okay, you also have something called a commentary. And this is not scientific in nature. It's the only thing that it is related to science is that a scientist wrote it. So it's an opinion article, and it could be, realistically, it could be on anything. You see these on political topics, you've seen them on, philanthropic topics, you see them on humanitarian topics, and since it comes from a scientist, it becomes valuable, of course, and so that's why it gets published in a paper. You do see opinion papers on Google Scholar, on the databases out there, which is quite interesting because it has nothing to do with the scientific method itself. It's basically just the opinion of a scientist or a group of scientists. And so similarly, you have editorials, which are commentaries but done by the journal. Essentially, they're unassigned. And so the journal itself is making a statement about a certain social or political or whatever it may be, a relevant topic in today's society. So these are basically the same, but this is done by a scientist or a group of scientists, and this is done by the journal itself. Okay, you also have letters to the editor. You could see these sprinkled in your databases, your research. Essentially, this is where somebody provides feedback to an editor of a paper. Within this letter, there may be questions asked, there may be feedback, there may be, relevant information towards the paper itself, towards the experiment done, relevant information to move forward and conduct a new study. So you do see these sprinkled in. As you can see, these are the more useless parts of the literature. And I would argue that, review articles, although helpful, it's difficult to attribute any weight to them because they don't employ scientific method. It's not an experiment. And so it's hard to gather truth. And this is largely due to how polluted the literature is. We know the literature is polluted, and I'm going to make a specific video on all of the reasons why. But, we have a reproducibility crisis. We have the positive research being prioritized and published more often. We have vested interests. There are so many reasons. I'm going to make a video on these topics to go in depth to why the literature is polluted. But essentially, what we're looking at here is that, it's hard to just trust a review article. It's really important. Review articles are a great place to go find original research papers. And so that's really important, I think, to consider, right? I think it's really important to consider going to look and do research within a review article itself, to go in and really look through the papers specifically. And it's interesting, there are kind of these pseudo review articles, especially surrounding the cupcakes that every person gets nowadays. It's interesting because they compile a number of original research papers and they reference all these papers. These are often published on the 3-letter websites, the CDC, FDA, things like that, about safety and efficacy and things like that. And realistically, I do really think that this is a means to separate the public from the true research, because you really have to go down a rabbit hole to find any original research papers on cupcakes. So I think that's important to consider. Now, they're not really called review articles. They're kind of just like safety assessment, whatever. But I urge you to go look into it a little bit. It's kind of interesting that the way it's structured, but I do think that it is a way to separate us from the original research. Because when you go and look at the original research, it's so very obvious that they're not employing the scientific method, right? They'll take cupcakes and compare them to injecting aluminum hydroxide into people, and both control groups, or both groups, experimental and control, have the same number of adverse effects. And so then they just say, well, they must be safe. But, that's no valid control, right? You should really be controlling it against the saline at the very least, right? Like, for some reason, we're controlling injecting heavy metals compared to injecting heavy metals and thinking that we've controlled anything because one has a live or attenuated piece of a microbe in it. It's foolish. It's absolutely foolish. There's no scientific method employed in these studies, right? And these are often clinical trials, right? They're on large groups of people because there are a certain number of clinical trials that these cupcakes or pharmaceuticals need to go through. But it's really amazing to see how deceiving it is, how deceiving these little compilations of these original research papers are. So, you can kind of see how they're all connected to. It's a little fun to read the editorials or the commentaries because you kind of see the bias realistically of the scientific literature itself. Like when the editorials, like Nature journal is big on the climate change. And so anytime Nature publishes anything about climate change, they're talking about the political campaign that's coming up in the States. They're coming to vote, right? So Nature will publish an editorial about how, our votes really matter. We really need to vote thinking about the environment because climate change is a real problem. And it's kind of just interesting to see. You can really get a good gist of the bias involved there. But yeah, as you can see here, we have the really valuable ones that we're looking at and assessing scientific literature to assess the scientific method within the literature itself. And that's realistically what we're concerned, because everything else doesn't matter, right? If you're thinking about science, it should be based on experiments that utilize the scientific method or falsification. That is the philosophy of science. That's how it should be employed. That's what we're trying to assess here. That's when we're getting to the crux of the truth of the scientific literature. What does the literature, what does the data mean? What does it all process? And this is, I'm sounding like a broken record, and really I'm beating this dead horse pretty good, but there's a reason for that. And we're nearing the end of our little lecture series here, our mini lecture series on how to do your own research. But yeah, all of this is important to understand because this can be confusing going into a research database and seeing all these different types of things. I should note that in Google Scholar, these types of search engines for the literature, you can also see books. You could see books, which again is not an original research paper. You can see books on there. It usually says it in brackets, book. And usually you get a little snippet of the book, which is actually kind of useful because you kind of get a free little sample of a book if you're looking it up on Google Scholar. So I kind of like Google Scholar, honestly. But it's Google, so you got to understand what you're working with there, right? But yeah, these are the types of journal articles. When it comes to understanding journal articles, the most important thing to consider and understand is to be able to identify original research papers. Now, just because it's an original research paper doesn't mean that it employs the scientific method. Admittedly, there are non-experimental and quasi-experimental experiments that use a sort of pseudo-scientific method for the quasi and no scientific method for the non-experimental groups. Things such as case studies, as I mentioned, or epidemiological research really is not using the scientific method whatsoever. Now, it becomes a little more complicated when we're talking about quasi-experiments, which we'll get more into in the next video and another video after that. But being able to decipher the differences in journal articles will help you in your researching. Realistically, scientific fact can come from proving a hypothesis, some may say. I would certainly say that it comes more so from falsification and from rationalism, but that's a topic for another discussion. However, if you're concerned with research and science, you need to be looking at scientific method being employed in papers, and so original research papers, largely considering randomized controlled trials, double, triple blind would be best. This is what you need to understand to be able to decipher this. And so this was meant to be introductory. If you found this informative in any way, give us a like, share, comment, or subscribe. That's the best way to help us grow and help support the channel at this point. I really hope you guys enjoyed that, so take care.